Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Eric Beaton. Eric, you and the Research, Implementation, and Safety team at DOT have spent a lot of time working and thinking about daylighting. Could you tell us a little bit about what daylighting is?
Sure. And daylighting is a little bit of a term of art, but we usually take it to mean the restriction of parking near corners so that there's more visibility for both pedestrians and drivers approaching so that they can see each other and see the street well.
And not all daylighting is created equally. So what are some of the ways we create that space?
Within the city, we have different levels where sometimes we do it just with signs. We can put up a no standing or no stopping sign that tells people that they can't be parked in that location. But increasingly, we can harden that daylighting. So that people really can't park there. Because I think we know nature abhors a vacuum, and parking space especially so. If there's space available, people will often park their car there. And so we can put something in that space. We can put bike racks, we can put big concrete blocks. Ideally, we even build it out into a full pedestrian neck down and just make it part of the sidewalk, which is a more challenging thing to do, but provides a better overall treatment.
So cities and towns across the United States and globally deploy daylighting to improve street safety. You have started to take a look at what this actually means for roadway safety in New York City. Could you talk about that work and how data is really informing your perspective there?
Yeah, and I think this is something where there's been very little study, in part because it sounds so obvious, right? Better visibility, It must be good. We don't even need to study it. But I think it really speaks to the value of doing good study, even when you think you know the answer. And sometimes you do the study and you find something that you were not expecting. And in some ways, that's one of the most challenging things is when you get data that doesn't match what you originally thought. And there's something called confirmation bias, where people tend to look much more at data that is in agreement with what they already think. And that's an easy thing to do because you say, like, yes, we were right the whole time.
Right.
But when you get data that's different, it really makes you take a step back and say, like, what are we really doing here? And so we took, as far as we can tell, was one of the first studies that really looked at the effect of daylighting on injuries. And the results were not what we were expecting. I think we thought we would find that hardened daylighting is better, but that all daylighting is at least a little helpful. And that's really not what we got at all. What we found is that hardened daylighting is helpful, just like many of our other safety tools, like medians and like leading pedestrian intervals. We like that and we want to keep doing it. But we found that unhardened daylighting was neutral, or in some cases even a negative for safety. And that made us take a step back and say, it's probably worth taking a moment, just because it's such an unusual result, to say, like, what did we do to get this? Did we twist the data just so that we could find a way to not take parking?
Yeah.
And we didn't. We actually had our very qualified data team do a deep dive without giving them any direction on what to find. And first, we looked at daylighting that we've installed around the city in recent years. And we did a before and after look, very natural. What were the injury rates before? What were the injury rates after? And that's where we found that hardened daylighting was really helping. The injury rates were going down in a very statistically significant way. And we found that the before and after for other locations was essentially zero and was not a statistically significant result. And these are locations that in some cases might have been done for visibility. In other cases, it might have been done to help large vehicles turn. But they were all locations that were intentionally done to create the daylighting at the corner. So that was one set of results. And then we wanted to look at a much broader set. So we looked at places where daylighting already occurs around the city. And these can be things like a fire hydrant that happens to be placed at the right location. Fire hydrants are very close to randomly distributed around the city. Sometimes they're on two sides of the street. Sometimes they're one side. Sometimes they're at the corner. Sometimes they're not. So it was as good a proxy as we could find for randomness. And we looked at what happens at intersections where fire hydrants are providing daylighting versus intersections where they aren't. And this was the really surprising piece, which was that injuries were higher at the locations that had this form of daylighting. At any individual location, it's not a big result, right? It's not that you see a fire hydrant and you have to think that that's a dangerous corner. But on aggregate, it made us think like, okay, if you do more of this, the number of injuries are going to go up. And if you do it at 40,000 intersections around the city, each risk can be individually small, but they can really add up to a lot. It could be as many as 15,000 more injuries in a year. And that made us go like, whoa, what's going on here? It made us think a little bit. One of our most successful safety treatment programs has been our turn calming program. And part of the point of turn calming is that we really tighten up the radius where people turn. So instead of being able to take a big wide sweep like you're getting on a highway ramp, you have to go to the corner and turn very slowly. It gives you a chance to see pedestrians a chance to see you. And even in the event that something happens, you're moving at slow speed. The risk of serious injury or death is much lower. So that's been a great program. The effect of unhardened daylighting is in some ways the opposite. You're taking something with a tighter turn radius and you're opening it up. So on the one hand, you get better visibility, but on the other hand, you've created this very wide space at the corner where people can turn more quickly. So we're still, this is a new result. We're still looking into it, but we think part of what may be going on is that people are able to turn more widely. And really drives us back to the point of when you do daylighting, we really wanted to have that hardened element to it so that people, that you get sort of both benefits, the additional visibility while still maintaining the street design that forces people to turn slowly.
Yes, and I think there are also just benefits of not just having empty space, but being able to use that space for additional amenities, seating, bicycle parking, greening, opportunities to just get more value out of our space and kind of have some double duty there at the corners.
In some ways it's obvious, in some ways it's not. When you put a bike rack out, people are going to park their bikes there. But we started putting out concrete blocks and granite blocks where the purpose is really just to occupy the space. But what you see is that they're the right height. People start sitting on them. We've done a number of art wraps where we can sort of enliven the public space by providing a little bit of public art at these locations. And we can make them into little miniature public spaces instead of just an empty space on the street. And the other point is, just as we know, if we create that empty space on the street, someone's going to park there, some truck is going to be there. That's true of the fire hydrants too, but in some ways makes that a really good comparison that we kind of know what happens when we just leave an unoccupied space in most parts of the city. New Yorkers like to park, and that's where they go.
Yeah. So all of this really interesting work that you've done has really challenged some assumptions about daylighting. When we go to communicate the results of a study or something that has very nuanced data, it can be hard to communicate beyond a quick headline. So I think what would you like to communicate as the main takeaways from the daylighting study? What should people really understand beyond, the initial headline?
One takeaway for sure is just that hardened daylighting is good. We're not in a position where we're saying daylighting, it's all bad, don't do it. Like we think done well, daylighting is really helpful. And then I think the flip side of that is just doing it broadly without thinking about individual locations, treating it as one size fits all, is not the right thing. Like there are parts of New York City, corners that are very different from each other. They have different needs. And when we do safety treatments, we should really think about what's right for that corner. And then I think more broadly, there's a point where, and you had a great guest on a couple of weeks ago talking about the book Killed by a Traffic Engineer. There's a lot of things that we as street designers have thought were good for safety over the years that turn out not to be. Right? We thought that wider roads and straighter roads and separating pedestrians from cars and getting rid of objects along the side of the street, every one of those was widely accepted as good for safety and became standard practice until someone actually studied it and said, what's happening here? And thankfully, we've now done a lot of work to undo a lot of those things, and because we have the good data behind it. And this may be another thing in that category of just because we thought it was a good idea, it doesn't mean it is. I also think there's a lot more research to do. Like I think the research we did pointed out that there may be an issue. Mm-hmm. I think as we do more, we're going to want to keep studying it and seeing what shows up in the data. But we at least want to make sure we're adjusting our behavior based on what we're finding, and making that a standard practice that we learn from what we do and we change our behavior accordingly.
Great. And also, the transportation landscape is also just so dynamic. So it's not only about the street, but it's how our vehicles are changing. It's about who's using vehicles and when. So just a lot to kind of stay on top of and really keep the pulse of what's actually happening, as you say, versus just relying on assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit about something that DOT has invested a tremendous amount of energy in, expanding speed cameras and red light cameras. Could you talk about that effort and the role of data in decision-making there?
Yeah, absolutely, because automated enforcement is one of the things that's just changed dramatically in the years since we focused on Vision Zero. We were part of developing the first Vision Zero action plan under Mayor de Blasio. And we wrote us this wish list of stuff that we said, okay, we'll put it in our 10-year plan, but it's never really going to happen. And we said, there should be speed cameras at 100 locations around the city, but probably won't get there. And then we look 10 years later and we have the ability to put 1,000 speed cameras out there, and they work. Right. And you see not just that they go out and people get tickets and they hate it and think that the city's out to get them, but that people get a ticket and they don't get more. That when we put a camera out there, over time, the number of tickets issued go down by 94%. And then what you see as well is that more than half the tickets that the speed cameras give out are given to people who have license plates not registered in New York City. So sometimes there's an idea that you're picking on this local community, but what really happens is that the local people learn that this is what's going on and they learn to drive better. But the people from out of town, out of state, are still driving fast, and those are the ones that we then have to be able to get to. Then to place them, we go to the data as well. For speed cameras, we look at two things. We look at where speeds are high, and this is where we get to go to some of those big data sources where we can say we have a pretty good idea of speeds on streets all over the city. So, where is the average speed high? Where is the 90th percentile speed high? And then we also look at crashes, because you want that intersection of two things, of high speeds and high crashes, because that's where speed cameras will be most effective. If it's just high speeds, but the crashes aren't happening, there's probably something we should be looking at there, but the crashes aren't happening. It's not incredibly urgent. And if there's crashes but not speeding, we say, yeah, we've got to do something there, but the speed cameras aren't the answer. It's enforcement or redesigning the street or something else. So you want to make sure that we're targeting the treatment to where it's most needed.
Part of your team is the freight team who is doing amazing, innovative work that is really transforming New York City. Could you talk a little bit about the role of data in kind of better understanding commercial versus residential freight usage, demand, and how that's kind of shaping programs and shaping the team's work in helping get people their packages in an efficient and safe way?
Yeah, and our freight team has really been at the leading edge in a lot of ways of understanding how things have changed around the city. We've always known that New York City is truck dependent. You don't have to be a genius in data to go look around and see that. There's not a lot of rail options. There's only so much. We know that trucks are making those deliveries, but understanding where they're going and where they're coming from and how that's changed has really helped change the way we do business, especially over the course of the 2020s. By the end of the 2019s, going into 2020, most deliveries in New York City were going to businesses. They were going to office buildings. They were going to stores. It was something in the neighborhood of 2/3 of those deliveries were happening at commercial establishments. And from our perspective, that's great. We knew they're going to these big locations. We can do loading zones there. They're going to come in a very predictable way. We had more work to do, but we had the plans. What happened is then we had the pandemic. People work from home more. People have different travel patterns. People are doing all kinds of different things. And it really lit a fire under the e-commerce trends that were already happening. And we have a reversal now where 60 to 70% of packages in New York City are delivered to residential addresses instead. And that's a very different problem for us because on the one hand, getting packages at home is part of what makes New York City continue to be a place that works, right? It helps you get goods at reasonable cost, it helps make people's lives work a lot better. And when you're doing a lot of things and being out in the city and potentially having long commutes, being able to have those goods delivered is important. But on the other hand, it means that trucks are going all over the place, that you have double parking in places that you didn't have it before, that you have trucks, larger trucks sometimes going in places where people don't expect them. And it's not always clear whether that's a truck making a shortcut, which they shouldn't do, or a truck that's making a delivery somewhere, which is allowed. And we need to be able to plan for that world too. So we started our neighborhood loading zone program, where particularly in denser parts of the city, we provide legal places for the trucks to be able to get to the curb and be able to load and unload without blocking bike lanes or bus stops or travel lanes. We look at, we just opened this week our first micro hubs on the Upper West Side.
Very exciting.
Which, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, the idea is that the truck should go to a neighborhood and stop once. Instead of going around block to block and dropping off 3 boxes here and 2 boxes there and just going down the street that way, they go and they stop. And then for a radius of about a quarter mile, they should be delivering those last mile goods by hand truck or by cargo bike or by someplace that's much less impactful on the transportation sphere. So this is something that hasn't been used all that much in the United States or even really around the world, but we think is trying to get at that issue of you can't deal with this if it's a completely dispersed problem. You don't know where the truck is going to be. But if you do know where the truck is going to be and you can facilitate that greener, safer last mile of delivery, then it works better for everyone. The trucking company knows that they're going to have a space where they can pull into, so it's efficient for them. For anyone who's on the street, they're not dealing with trucks circling and double parking and all over the place because that truck is out of traffic. And that last mile is being delivered by human-powered or by electric-powered vehicles. So we think it's going to work really well. We'll stay tuned to make sure that it all fits together properly. But it is the kind of solution that needs to get at the changing world we live in.
So speaking of feelings, New Yorkers have very big emotions about cyclists.
You don't say.
As well as cycling infrastructure. And that's almost 2 different groups. There is the interaction with cyclists that we hear a lot about. And then there's also the bike lane on that street, right? Could you talk a little bit about the work that New York City has done to make a more thriving, cycling-friendly city and what the data is actually telling us about the impacts of that cycling infrastructure?
Sure. And there's 2 sides of it. The first is, of course, we want more people to bike, right? It is incredibly environmentally friendly. It's something that can make you feel good. It keeps you healthy. We want to get more New Yorkers on bikes. But I think we also recognize that most trips in New York City are not going to be made by bike anytime soon. There are people who can bike and people who may not be able to. And we need a system that works for everybody. So then people come to us and they say, why are you doing all this stuff for cyclists? They're not a huge portion of the traveling public out there. And I just see you doing all these huge projects for them. And, first there's a little bit of, what does for them mean? A very large number of New Yorkers cycle sometimes, even if they're not cycling to work every day. Mm-hmm. And you have working cyclists, you have parents, you have children, and you want to create safe space for all of them. But more importantly, designing a street that's good for cyclists becomes good for everybody. And, when we put a protected bike lane out on a street, what we see is that there's a benefit to cyclists. The actual number of cyclist injuries stays actually fairly level because the number of cyclists increases so much. Mm-hmm. The risk has gone far down. But what we see is the safety improves for everyone. The total number of deaths and serious injuries on the street goes down by about 18%. The number of pedestrian serious injuries and fatalities goes down by about 29%. And for some of our most vulnerable, the older New Yorkers, the amount goes down by almost 40%. This creates a street that is safer even if you plan to never touch a bike in your life. And the reason for that is it creates a more predictable street. You know where the cyclists are going to be. You know where the traffic is going to be. People are not weaving around so much. We are able to create shorter distances so that people have less street to cross. It helps everyone obey the rules much better. A little piece of it is that, one of the things we always hear about cyclists is that they're just running red lights. What can you do about that? And the answer is, of course, always partially enforcement, right? Like no one should run a red light. That's unsafe for you. It's unsafe for everyone else on the street. But we also know that the police are never going to be everywhere at every time. So we want to think about what are the things we can be doing to encourage cyclists to follow the rules. And one of them that we're trying out right now is to have traffic signals aimed specifically at cyclists. And when I say aimed, not just, oh, we want them to look there, but aimed as in they are at eye level for cyclists right there on the street. And it's not just car infrastructure that cyclists are expected to follow. It is something that is very visible to them. And when you combine it with things like good signage and designs that encourage people to slow down at intersections and traffic signal progressions that work at the speed of cyclists, that they have a benefit for following the greens, we think that these can really work together to make a more predictable street, which is good for cycling, but also good for everyone else out there.
Absolutely. And so much of the work that we're seeing from the agency now is a really comprehensive approach to incorporating all of the different street users and their experience to really create a comprehensive, safer and improved environment for everyone on the road. Hey, listeners, we hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. For those of you who are as enthusiastic about transportation and planning as we are, we'd like to hear from you. You can submit topics and questions that you'd like us to cover at nyc.gov/curb enthusiasm. And now, back to our conversation. I want to talk a little bit about Vision Zero. We are 10 years into this amazingly collaborative effort that really utilized data to drive focused results. What do the next 10 years of Vision Zero look like?
As a baseline, it means doing more of what we're doing because it's working, right? Fatalities are down very substantially from where they were 10 years ago in a way that's not, that's really exceeded what we've seen in peer cities around the country. But it's also, what do we add to that? Like it's what we're doing plus. Over the past 10 years, we've made so many advances in terms of street design and enforcement technology. So we're going to keep doing that. But the big things out there are no longer the Queens Boulevards of the world where you have, a dozen people who might be killed on a single street in a year. It's much more spread out. You start to look at the dangerous drivers that are out there. A very large number of fatalities are caused by people where it's predictable. They've had prior DUIs, they've had prior license suspensions or current license suspensions, and you see it and you say, that was not an accident, right? That was predictable. And how do we try to get those people either off the street or driving more safely? And then it's looking at vehicle design too, that, Europe is far ahead of us. In London, you can't drive a truck in that doesn't have really excellent visibility. And the laws are different. In the United States, it's not quite so easy to just say we're going to have a different safety standard for New York City. But working at the local, state, and federal levels, how do we all work to make sure that the vehicles we're putting on the street are not just protecting the people who are inside the vehicles, but the people around them as well? And I think those are going to be the two really big new things that we add over the next decade. How we do those, I think that there's still a lot of work to do. Because they're not entirely under our control. We're going to need a lot of partnerships, but we can still set the way. And by working towards it, we find that even though we can't do everything ourselves, we're able to accomplish quite a lot just by being so large and being so out in the public. And frankly, sometimes by having so much purchasing power. Right? When we contract with trucking companies, we can tell them that what they have to use. We more or less created the truck side guard program from scratch with our partners at DCAS because we're such a big player in the world that they start doing it for us and then it becomes natural to start doing it elsewhere. So I think we want to leverage however much of that we can to be able to push the industry, to push the world where it needs to be.
Yeah. And is there any data that we are just testing out or just starting to use that you are excited about or anticipating will play a big role in how we think about Vision Zero in the next decade?
I think really looking at sensors and what we can get from them, because something that we hear from people is, okay, the data isn't saying that there's crashes happening, but there's a lot of almost crashes. And that's something that it doesn't show up in our data, but can also be true.
Yeah.
And we can put up a sensor now, and this is what we're testing, and we think it's going to get there, even if it's not there today. But you can put up a sensor, and it can start telling you about near misses, things that could have been a bad incident if only someone hadn't moved at the last minute. And that lets us be more proactive and get ahead of what's happening. Because if you're only going to where the fatality happened, like, we need to do that, that's good, but you want to go to where the fatality might be next. And I think we do some of that now with the data we have, but with these new sensors, we think we'll be able to do even more.
Right. And I think those near miss moments also play into people's feeling and their understanding of a space as safe or not. So targeting those moments as something we need to tackle and fix will help overall change the experience and the level of comfort people feel on our streets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So wanted to ask you, what is your biggest breach of transportation etiquette?
I don't know if it's etiquette exactly, but I certainly hope I gave some people a good New York story where I was getting on the shuttle at Grand Central, and the doors are closing, and then a couple from out of town jumps on, and you can tell that they were from out of town. They were looking around for where to be, and they turn to me and they say, like, how many stops to get to Grand Central? And I'm looking, and the train's pulling out of the station, and I just say, 2 stops. 2 stops and you'll be there. And and then I got off the train at Times Square and never looked back. But I hope that they had that experience and thought of it as the story that they can tell, instead of the New Yorker who was a jerk and didn't just tell them what was going on. But I sort of like it as like it was actually the answer for where they were right there. They didn't have a chance to do anything else, and let them maybe learn a little something about where they were.
Yeah, great. And something we like to ask all of our guests, what are you most enthusiastic about for the future of transportation? So
something that really excites me is how people have started to view this as a career. That we hire a tremendous number of people who are just excited to work here, and they come here sometimes from an environmental field or a public safety field or an engineering field, and realize that this is a way to really make an effect on people's lives every day. And what makes me hopeful for the future is that this isn't just a wave of people that's going to stop now, a wave of change that's going to happen. We're building a whole new generation of people who understand that the roads need to change to match how the rest of society is changing. And as much as changing any individual street matters to me, making sure that we're setting up the agency, setting up the world to be able to keep making that change is incredibly important. And that's part of what makes me excited for work every day.
Yeah, amazing. And definitely, I think a privilege that we all feel at transportation agencies is being able to change and improve the streets in the city we live in every day is, such a fantastic privilege and opportunity here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, Eric, thank you so much. It was lovely to see you on the 9th floor instead of the usual 6th floor interactions. Really appreciate you taking the time. You have a tremendous portfolio with many demands, and we really appreciate your insight and thoughts about this incredibly important use of data in our work every day.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Any chance I have to be excited about data and all the ways we use it, I'm going to take that.